Sloan, the arm. Cover it. My mother said it the way she'd send back a bottle of wine. Quiet, pleasant, final. Mr. Tolve. Vance is about to write the biggest check of my career, and he does not need to be looking at that over his salmon. It was 8:40 on a Friday, and the ice in my water hadn't even started to melt. 9 of us at a table set for a house nobody lived in. A $2.4 million listing my mother was selling. Staged down to the lilies and the smell of fresh paint, and the little cans of sterno keeping the salmon warm. I kept my left hand flat on the white tablecloth. I could taste copper at the back of my teeth, the way you do when you're holding still on purpose. My back was straight. It's always straight. That's the one thing they never took. And at the head of the table, my mother's boss set down his glass. He didn't do it loudly. A tall man, silver at the temples, the founder of the whole firm. He just stopped, mid-sentence, and looked at my forearm the way most people are too polite to. Not at my face. At the graft. At the mesh of it, the pale grit of skin that isn't quite skin. The room caught it the way a room catches a change in cabin pressure. Everybody feels it before anybody understands it. Forks went down. My mother's smile stayed up a half second too long, then began, very slightly, to come apart. Before I tell you what a stopped watch means to a man who spent 9 years pulling pilots off a table, and before I tell you why my own mother needed every person in that room to believe a kitchen did this to me, you should know who I actually am, not who they thought. My name is Sloan Keller. My mother's guests believed I flew for a hospital. That part was even true. To understand why she needed all of them to believe a stove, you have to go back to the spring. She decided the army would fix me. My mother is very good at gratitude. Professionally good. If you drove through our county, you'd have seen her face on the bus benches. Diane Keller. Military-friendly agent of the year. She serves those who served. There was a little flag in the corner of every sign, and the flag was always the right shade of red, because my mother notices shades of red. She threw a barbecue every Memorial Day for our heroes and posted the photos before the coals were cold. She could stand in front of 100 strangers and talk about sacrifice until people reached for their napkins. She had never once asked me a real question about the deployment. Not one. Not what happened over there. Not does the arm hurt when it's cold. Not how did you sleep the first year home. She asked me whether I could wear something with sleeves to the Hendersons. She asked me not to bring it up at Thanksgiving. When the burn was new and shining and I'd flinch if a plate got too close, she told her friend Carol it had been a grease fire. And Carol said, "Oh honey, a grease fire, the worst. Those splatter." And my mother said that's exactly what happened. And looked at me the way you look at a child you've told to be quiet in church. And I was quiet in church. That's the part I can't fully explain to you even now. I let it stand, a grease fire. I let a woman I'd never met feel sorry for me about a stove, because correcting it felt like making a scene, and making a scene felt like being a burden. And being a burden is the one thing I have spent my whole life refusing to be. Here's the thing, nobody tells you about being the reliable one. You don't become reliable because you're strong. You become reliable because somewhere back there you learned that the fastest way to not be a problem is to solve everyone else's. I was 11 the year my parents' marriage went down in a slow fire of its own, and I learned to read a room the way you learn to read weather. Early, and for your own survival. My father left. The money left with the parts of him that were worth anything. And my mother, who was terrified, decided the thing to do with a difficult teenage daughter was to hand her to an institution that specialized in difficult people. I still remember the recruiter's office, fluorescent hum, a poster of a helicopter I would one day learn to fly, and my mother saying, "She just needs some discipline," to a sergeant who was kind enough not to say anything back. She signed me over to the army the way you'd sign a kid up for a camp that promises to build character. She did not think about what character costs. She never let herself think about it again. I'll tell you the one time the mask slipped, because it matters later. It was a Christmas. Years after the burn, I'd reached across her kitchen for a dish and my sleeve rode up and I caught her looking, not away for once but at it, at the pale grit of it, and her face did something I'd never seen it do. I've been misread my whole life, so I know how much it costs to read someone right, and what crossed my mother's face in that half second before she turned back to the sink wasn't disgust. It was closer to terror. she said, sleeves, Sloan, very quietly, and ran the tap too hot. I filed it under cruelty because cruelty was simpler to carry. It took me 20 years to understand I'd been looking at the opposite of cruelty, wearing cruelty's coat. I flew medevac, dust off. If you don't know what that is, it's the aircraft that comes for you on the worst day of your life. The unarmed helicopter. The one with the red cross that isn't supposed to get shot at, and gets shot at anyway. You fly toward the thing everyone else is flying away from. You keep the aircraft steady while someone in the back does the impossible math of keeping a 19-year-old alive for 11 more minutes. I was good at it. I was calm in a way that had nothing to do with peace. I was calm because I'd been calm since I was 11, and finally there was a job that paid for it. My grandfather understood. Roy. My mother's father, which is its own kind of irony. He'd been in Korea in the cold that they don't put in the recruiting posters. And he was the only person in my family who ever looked at what I did and saw the whole shape of it instead of the inconvenient parts. When I earned my wings, he gave me his watch. An old steel thing, heavier than it looked. The crystal already a little scratched from a life he mostly didn't talk about. So you always know what time you did it, he said. And he didn't explain what it was. And he didn't have to. I wore that watch on my left wrist, the one that burned. It stopped at 4:17. I'll get to that. Understand for now only this. The watch on my wrist has read 4:17 for years, and I have never had it fixed. And when someone at that dinner table leaned over and said, "Your watch is broken, sweetheart," I said, "I know," and I moved my arm off the table and I changed the subject because that is what I do. I move the arm, I change the subject, I keep the aircraft steady. After the crash, after the graft, after the year of learning how to hold a coffee cup again, the Army offered me something good, an instructor slot. Warm and dry and stateside, a track that ends in rank, the thing you're supposed to want. I turned it down. I took a job flying air ambulance for a hospital an hour from my grandfather because Roy was getting old and someone in this family was going to be near him when it mattered. And it was not going to be the daughter who was busy being agent of the year. The job is mostly waiting. People think flying air ambulance is the loud part, the rotors, the lights, the run to the pad. And it is for about 4 minutes at a time. The rest is a recliner in a crew room at 2 in the morning and a radio that might go off and might not. You learn to sleep in 12-minute pieces. You learn to come fully awake between one breath and the next, which is a thing your body remembers long after the war is over and doesn't ask your permission to keep. There was a night last winter. I'll tell you about it because it's the truest thing I know about myself, and it has nothing to do with my mother, which is exactly why it matters. 3:40 in the morning. A rollover on the county highway, a kid, 17, and a flight nurse named Priya in the back, who was better at her job than I am at mine. We flew him in over a countryside that was all dark and frost. No lights anywhere but the ones on our own aircraft. And the whole world narrowed down to the instruments and the sound of Priya talking to a boy who couldn't answer, telling him the ordinary miracles. "You're doing great. We've got you. 12 more minutes." The same 12 more minutes I'd flown 100 times in another country with another crew. And I was calm, not peaceful. Calm the way I've been calm since I was 11. The way that got me through a recruiter's office and a burning cockpit, and would, one day, get me through a dinner table. Somewhere over that frozen field, I thought, this is the only place I have ever been exactly the right size. Not too much. Not a scene. Not a recliner in anybody's garage. Just a pilot keeping the aircraft steady while someone in the back does the impossible math. Nobody up here has ever once asked me to cover my arm. Up here, it's just the thing that lets me hold the collective still when it's cold. Up here, I have never once had to be smaller than I am. We landed. The boy lived. I didn't tell anyone in my family about it, because there was no one in my family to tell. So that was the true version. A woman who flew toward fires chose a quieter life to be near the one person who saw her, and paid the property taxes on her grandfather's empty house out of her own account every October so nobody would have to sell it. And here's the version my mother sold. My daughter flies for a hospital. She keeps to herself. She had a little accident years ago. We don't really talk about it. Both sentences were technically true. That's the thing about my mother. She never lied so much as she edited. She took the truth and cut out the parts that didn't stage well. The way she'd move a client's ugly recliner into the garage before showing. My service was the recliner. My arm was the recliner. She kept me in the garage and showed the house. Roy died last spring, quietly, in his sleep, the way the tough ones almost never get to. And within a month, my mother was talking about finally doing something with the old place. Listing it, flipping it, turning the one house where I'd ever been seen into a commission and a story about herself. I said I'd keep paying the taxes. She said, "Sloan, that's sentimental, it's just sitting there." I said nothing. I moved the arm. I changed the subject. 2 weeks before the dinner, she called me. Not to ask how I was, to ask me to come. "It's the firm's big salute to service night," she said, and I could hear her already staging it in her head. "Warren throws it every year. That's my broker, Warren Hale. He's a real veteran, so it means something to him. Everyone who's anyone will be there. Marcus Vance is coming and I am this close on his portfolio." A pause. Then, gently, the way she says the cruel things. "Wear something with long sleeves, would you?" For me, just keep it classy. Keep it classy. Come to the night we throw to honor people who serve, and hide the fact that you're one of them. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I have flown into places people spend their whole lives being grateful they'll never see, but I have never in my life figured out how to say no to my mother. So I said yes to a dinner honoring service, on the condition that I hide my own. And what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, driving out to that empty house with my sleeves buttoned to the wrist, was that this was the night my mother's careful, edited version of me was finally going to run out of room to stand in. The person who took it apart wasn't going to be me. I'd never once had the nerve. It was going to be a stranger at the head of the table, and he was going to do it in under 2 minutes, over the salmon, without once raising his voice. The house was perfect, and that was the first thing that was wrong with it. You learn, if you spend enough time in real places, cockpits, field hospitals, the kitchen of a man who lived alone for 30 years, you learn what a place looks like when someone actually lives in it. This house looked like an idea of living. I opened the refrigerator looking for water, and there were exactly 3 bottles of it and 1 unopened box of matches and nothing else. And I stood there for a second in the cold light of it, feeling something I couldn't name. And then I understood. Nobody lived here. My mother sold houses that nobody lived in to people who wanted the idea more than the thing. It was, I realized, the family business in more ways than one. The salute to service banner hung over the fireplace. Someone had spelled it in that expensive script font that costs money to look effortless. There were 40-odd guests, agents and clients, and a local council member, and a string quartet's worth of recorded strings coming out of hidden speakers, and my mother moving through all of it like weather. Touching an elbow here, laughing there, the whole room bending very slightly toward her wherever she went. And at the head of the long table, when we finally sat, was Warren Hale. I want to be fair to him because I didn't know yet what I know now. At first he was just my mother's boss. Tall, unhurried, the kind of quiet that comes from either great wealth or great tiredness, and in his case turned out to be both. He wore a plain dark suit and no flag pin, which I noticed because the men who've actually done the thing tend not to wear the flag on their lapel. They wear it somewhere you can't see. He shook my hand and his grip was careful, the way a doctor's is careful, and he said, "Diane's daughter. She mentions you." And something in the way he said mentions told me exactly how little she'd told him. My mother introduced me to the table like a caption. "This is Sloan. She flies for Mercy General. Medical transport, very impressive, very her. She was always the serious one." She said it the way you'd read the label on a wine you were slightly embarrassed to be serving. Then she moved the conversation on before anyone could ask a second question. Because a second question is where the recliner comes out of the garage. Marcus Vance sat 2 seats down. Money, the new kind, loud in a quiet suit. He was talking about a development, about honoring the community's fabric. And my mother was nodding at a frequency I recognized, the nod she does when she's an inch from a signature. I was scenery. I'd been scenery my whole life. I knew how to do it. I kept my arm in my lap. I answered the small questions and deflected the medium ones. I found the exits without looking like I was finding the exits. 2. The front door and a side door off the staged kitchen. 3.5 seconds to either. You never turn that off. 22 years and you never turn it off. Warren Hale talked less than anyone at that table and watched more than all of them combined. At one point, the council member asked him about the firm, and he said something that I only understood later. I got into houses, he said, because I spent a long time in buildings where people came apart, and I wanted to spend the rest of it in ones where they put themselves together. A polite laugh moved around the table. My mother laughed too. A beat late because she wasn't listening. She was watching Vance's wine glass to time her next move. I was the only one who heard the word buildings and felt the temperature of it. He said it like a man who'd been in more than one field hospital. His eyes came to rest, for just a second, on my wrist, on the watch, the dead watch reading 417, and then moved on, and I told myself I'd imagined it. Later, my mother would tell me she'd worked for Warren Hale for 11 years and never known he'd been a doctor. That's the thing about my mother. She'd sat in his conference room 100 times, closed deals under a photograph on his wall. She'd never really looked at. A unit photograph. Young men and women squinting into a desert sun in front of a tent with a red cross on it. She walked past it every day. She sold proximity to service for a living and never once stopped to read the room she was standing in. I'd been in his building 4 minutes and I'd read the whole thing. That isn't a talent. It's a wound. You don't learn to see a room that fast unless something taught you the hard way that the room might kill you. My mother never had to learn it. She got to keep her innocence about rooms and she spent it on staging houses nobody lived in. Somewhere around the second course, my mother stood. She has a way of standing that makes a room go quiet for her, and it did. She lifted her glass toward the banner over the fireplace and said, in the warm voice she keeps for strangers, "To those who serve, we see you." 40 glasses went up. I lifted mine too, a beat late the way you do, my other arm still in my lap. The woman who'd asked me to wear sleeves was toasting "We see you" 2 feet from a daughter who'd served and was sitting there covered up. And not one person in that room understood they were looking at the toast and the thing it was supposed to be about in the very same breath. Then Vance made a joke about wounded warriors, one of those jokes that isn't cruel exactly, just careless, a man who's never bled, making the word sacrifice sound like a marketing category, and my mother laughed at it, fully warmly. I've noticed that the louder she gets, the stiller I go. It's a thing our 2 bodies worked out a long time ago without asking either of us. I felt my grandfather's watch cold against my burned wrist, and I did the thing I always do. I went somewhere else in my head. I went back to 417. I don't tell this part often, so I'll tell it plainly. It was afternoon. We were coming in low with 2 casualties in the back and 1 crew. My crew chief Wyatt, 19 years old from a town in Ohio I'd never heard of, who called everyone sir, including me, and once cried. Quietly so, I'd pretend not to see over a soldier we lost between the pickup and the pad. We came in hard. I'll leave out the why. Some of it is still not mine to say. The aircraft came down and it came apart, and then it did the thing helicopters do, which is burn. Fuel and hot metal, and that particular smell that never leaves you, that lives in the back of your sinuses for the rest of your life, waiting for a barbecue or a candle to bring it back. Wyatt was pinned. His door was crushed inward and he was pinned, and the fire was coming up through the deck. And I had a decision to make in the time it takes to make no decision at all. I put my left arm through what was left of the window frame, and I found the release and I held it. I held metal that was already too hot to hold, and I pulled him out by his vest as the tank went. And I felt my own arm cooking, and I did not feel it because adrenaline is a liar, and it tells you you're fine right up until the moment it's done lying. 22 minutes I sat in that wreck afterward, waiting to be cut free of my own aircraft, holding a 19-year-old's hand with the hand that still worked. A medic reached in at some point to get the watch off me and I wouldn't let him. Said leave it. My watch had stocked at 4017, the crystal scorched but not broken, and I wanted to keep it exactly there. Roy was right. I always know what time I did it. Wyatt lived. I want you to hold on to that, because it matters later more than anything else in this story. Wyatt lived. Sloan. My mother's voice, from a great distance, pulling me back into a dining room in America. Sloan, Mr. Vance asked you a question. I hadn't heard it. I said I was sorry. Vance waved it off, benevolent, and turned back to my mother. And that's when a young man in a server's white shirt reached between us to refill my glass and paused. Just for a second. He looked at my forearm, not the way Vance would have, not squeamish, and then he looked at me at my face. And something passed over his own that I recognized because I'd worn it myself in 1,000 grocery stores and airports. Ma'am, he said, very low, just for me. Were you in? PFC Cortez. National Guard, he told me later, working catering on the weekends because the drill pay doesn't cover a kid and a car, 20 years old. He'd seen the graft and known the way we always know each other. And he'd asked the question my own mother had never once thought to ask. Were you in? 2 words. I felt something in my chest do a thing it hadn't done in a long time. Yeah, I said, I was. He nodded once, like that settled something in his own week, and moved on with the wine. And across the table, my mother's smile tightened, because a server had spoken to me longer than the situation called for, and my mother notices things that are off-brand. And that is when Marcus Vance, reaching for the bread, finally let his eyes fall all the way onto my arm and did the small, involuntary thing squeamish people do, a flinch, a glance away, a shift in his chair. And my mother saw it. She saw a flinch from the man about to write the biggest check of her career. She leaned toward me. She put her hand over mine on the table, warm, maternal, for the benefit of the room. And under it, in a voice pitched exactly low enough, she said the thing this whole night had been walking toward. Sloan, the arm, cover it. Mr. Vance is about to write the biggest check of my career, and he does not need to be looking at that over his salmon. And at the head of the table, Warren Hale set down his glass. He didn't stand. That's the part I remember. In every version of this you imagine, the important man stands, and the whole room stands with him. He didn't. He just stopped, and the stopping was louder than standing would have been. Diane? His voice was mild. It was the mildest thing in the room, and it cut through everything. What did you say happened to your daughter's arm? My mother recovered fast. She always recovers fast. Oh, Warren, it's nothing. An old accident we don't need to. You told Carol Hendricks it was a grease fire. Not accusing. Just placing a fact on the table. Face up, where everyone could see it. I heard you tell her at the spring open house. A grease fire. It was a kitchen thing years ago. No, Hale said. It wasn't. He was looking at my arm now, and he was looking at it the way no one at that table had ever looked at it. Not away, not through, but at. With attention. With something that, in a lesser man, might have been called rudeness, and in him was the opposite of rudeness. That's a meshed, split-thickness graft, he said to no one, to the room, to 40 years of his own life. You can see the pattern. They mesh it so it covers more surface, so it drains. You don't get that from a stove. His eyes moved to the edge of the graft, then, without asking, to the faint second scar just visible where my sleeve had ridden up. The donor site, where they take the good skin to cover the ruined skin. And that's the harvest site. Thigh, usually. But they went to the forearm's edge, which means they were short on canvas. Which means there was a lot to cover. He said it gently. He said it the way you'd tell someone something true about themselves that they'd spent years hoping no one would say out loud. That's not a house fire, Diane. That's an aircraft fire. I've had my hands in 100 of them. The table had gone completely silent. Not the polite silence of a lull. The other kind. He looked at me then, right at me, for the first time all night, really seeing the person and not the caption. Which roll 3 took you? He asked. It's a question only one kind of man asks. The combat support hospital. The place the worst of us gets flown to. He was asking where I'd been put back together, and I found to my own surprise that I could answer him. Because he'd earned it. In the last 90 seconds, more than my own blood had earned it in 20 years. I told him. He nodded slowly the way a man sets a heavy thing down. And then he did something I didn't understand yet. He started to talk. Not to me, not to the table, but almost to himself, The way you talk when a thing you've carried for years suddenly turns and shows you its face. There's a man I sponsor, he said. Have for years. His schooling, a hand up when he needed one. I've had dinner at his house. I know his wife. I know his little girl. He was a crew chief, 19 years old on the worst afternoon of his life, pinned in a dust-off that went down and caught fire. And the pilot came back through it for him, reached into the fire, found the release, pulled him out by his vest before the tank went, then sat in the wreck holding his hand for 22 minutes until they cut them both free. Hale's voice had gone very quiet. He's told me that story 100 times, and there's one detail he always ends on, the one that breaks him, every year. His eyes moved to my wrist, to the dead watch reading 4:17. The pilot's watch had stopped in the crash. And when the medics finally got them out, and one of them went to take it off her, the pilot wouldn't let him. Said, believe it, said, I always want to know what time I did it. And there it was, my grandfather's sentence, in a stranger's mouth, coming back across 20 years and a burning field. I couldn't breathe. Warren Hale looked at me, and I watched him finish the math. The graft, the roll 3, the watch, the words, and arrive. You were the pilot, he said. Yes, I said. He sat back in his chair, and he was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. The mildness had something underneath it now, something with a floor of iron. His name is Eli Wyatt, he said, and now his voice broke, just slightly, just at the one seam. He's 29 now. He works 2 towns over. And he has spent 10 years trying to find the pilot who came back for him. He almost laughed, a wet, astonished sound. His daughter. He stopped, and looked at me, and did not finish, because we both knew, and finishing it would have been more than either of us could stand. You've been an hour away this whole time, Sloan, sitting at your mother's dinner table, being told to cover your arm. The word Sloan out of his mouth landed on the table like a rank being read. Chief Warrant Officer Keller. He didn't have to say the rank. Everyone heard it anyway. I looked at my mother. The blood had gone out of her face. I have seen a lot of faces at 4017, faces at the worst moment of their lives, and I had never seen my mother's do this. Her hand was still on the table where it had been covering mine, but it was trembling now, and she was reaching, I could see her reaching, for the story, for the edit, for the version of this that staged well, and for the first time in her life, in front of the biggest client of her career and the boss she'd spent a decade impressing, she reached for a story. And there was nothing there. There was no recliner big enough to hide this in the garage. The house was on fire and everyone could see it. The woman who could run any room she walked into. The woman who an hour before had lifted a glass and told 40 strangers we see you, sat in the middle of it and could not find a single word. The ice in my glass had finally melted. At the start of the night, it had been solid. I'd clocked it, the way I clock everything. And now it was only water. The one thing in that frozen room still moving. 8:40. It had been solid. It hadn't taken an hour. Marcus Vance was looking at her. Not the way he looked at her all night. He was looking at her the way you look at someone you've just discovered will say anything. I said one thing. Only one. I've thought about it a lot since, whether I should have said more, and I've decided I said exactly enough. I turned to my mother, and I kept my voice as level as a horizon, and I said, it wasn't a stove. And then I took my arm off the table, and I stopped hiding it, and I let every person in that room look at what 20 years had actually cost, and I did not look away from a single one of them. Here is what I thought would happen. In the years I imagined a moment like this, I thought it would feel like winning. It didn't. I want to be honest with you because I think the honest thing is the useful thing. There's a story people tell about moments like this. The great vindication the villains face. The sweet, clean flood of it. And I'd waited a long time to feel that flood. And when the moment finally came, what I felt instead was grief. Enormous, quiet, adult grief. Because when Warren Hale said my name and the whole table finally saw me, what I felt was not at last, I understand, it was there it is. The thing I've always known and never once said out loud, my mother was never going to be the one to see me. Not couldn't. Wasn't going to. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole thing. For 20 years, I told myself my silence was love, that I hid the arm to spare her, to keep the peace, to be the one who never added weight. And I want to be careful here because I don't want you to think a stranger at a dinner table changed me. He didn't. What I'd done in that helicopter I could have done any afternoon of my life. The steadiness that let me sit in that wreck for 22 minutes was the same steadiness that got me through a recruiter's office at 17. And the same one that got me through this. I was not a different person at the end of that dinner than I was at the start of it. The only thing that changed was that the room could finally see the person who'd been sitting there the whole time. And the story my mother had built to stand inside fell down around her, not me. I hadn't kept the peace. I'd kept her secret. And I'd called it love for 20 years because calling it love was quieter than saying the true thing out loud. And now I'll tell you the part I'm not sure about because I promised you honesty and this is where it costs me something. I don't entirely blame her. I know how that sounds. I know some of you are ahead of me, wanting me to burn her down, and I understand the wanting. But I've flown too many people out of the worst days of their lives to believe that anyone is only the worst thing they've done. My mother was 29 and terrified and out of money and out of a marriage when she signed me over to a recruiter and told herself it was discipline. And I think I've had a long time to think that the grease fire was never really about the client or the brand or the salmon. I think about her face that Christmas, the thing I mistook for cruelty. I think my mother told the world it was a stove because if it was a stove, then it wasn't a helicopter, and if it wasn't a helicopter, then she never signed the papers that put me in one. And she never had to look at the pale grit on my arm and understand that she was part of how it got there. The lie wasn't cruelty, or wasn't only cruelty. It was a woman who could not survive her own guilt, building a smaller, safer story to live inside, which, if I'm honest, is the same thing I'd been doing from the other side of it for 20 years. Warren Hale found me a week later. He'd gotten my number from my mother, the last useful thing she did in this story, and she did it because she was ashamed, which I'll take. He wanted to do something. He wanted to put me in front of a room. There's a foundation, Veterans in Transition, the firm sponsors it, and he wanted my story, the pilot who came back through the fire, hidden in plain sight for 10 years, an hour from the man she saved. He said it would move people. He said it would raise real money for people who needed it. And I believe he meant every word, and I believe it was true. I said no. I want to tell you why, because it's the same why as everything else. For 20 years, I let my mother turn me into a story she could use. A useful daughter. A serious one. A recliner in the garage, a caption at a dinner. And I had just watched a stranger. A kind stranger. A good man with a good cause offer to do the same thing from the other direction. To make me a simple. To put the arm on a stage this time instead of in a garage, but a stage is just a garage that claps. My mother had always needed me useful. Deployable, hideable, standing next to the brand. She had never once needed me seen. I'd known the difference between those two things my whole life. What I did that night was simply stop accepting the lesser one, however kind the hand holding the door. I told Warren Hale I wasn't a story. I told him I'd fly for his foundation any night he wanted. I'd fly the missions, do the work, the quiet, unglamorous thing I've always done. But I wouldn't stand on his stage and be the pale grid on my arm for anybody's cause, however good. I was done being what other people made of me. And that good, tired man looked at me for a long moment, and then he did the thing that told me everything about why his crew loved him back when he had a crew. He said, "Okay, just that." And he never asked again. I don't talk to my mother anymore. I want to tell you it's more complicated than that, and it is, and it also isn't. I didn't make a speech. There was no final confrontation, no scene, no monologue where I list every year of it and watch it land. I've never been able to make a scene. It turns out that even at the end I couldn't. I just stopped. I stopped answering the calls that came for 3 weeks and then stopped coming. I stopped being available. She is a woman who requires an audience the way the rest of us require air, and I have simply, finally, left the theater. The cruelest thing I could ever do to my mother was also the kindest thing I could ever do to myself. And they turned out to be the same act, and no one warns you about that. She lost the Vance account. I heard that secondhand and I felt nothing about it, which is its own kind of ending. You know you're free when the thing you once would have paid any price to protect happens. And it doesn't cost you a heartbeat. I kept my grandfather's house. That's the one thing I fought for, quietly, with a lawyer instead of my fists, the way Roy would have wanted. The way I've always won anything worth winning. It's mine now. The taxes come out of my account every October like they always did, except now nobody calls it sentimental. I go out there sometimes and sit in his kitchen, a real kitchen, in a house where a person actually lived. And it is the opposite of that staged mansion in every way that matters. There's a dent in the counter where he set a hot pan down for 30 years. There's a life in it. I pour a glass of water from his tap and drink it standing at the counter, cold and real and kept nice for no buyer. And I think of the untouched glasses on that stage table, the ice that never got the chance to melt. You can feel the difference between a house someone lived in and a house someone sold. And I'll take the dent every time. But I want to be honest about the cost. Because I told you at the start, this wasn't a fairy tale. And the honest thing is that I did not walk away with everything. I walked away with a house and without a mother. And those don't balance. There's a wound there that hasn't closed, and I've stopped waiting for it to. I don't get the mother I needed. I never did. The little girl in the recruiter's office. The one who just wanted to be seen before she was sent away. She doesn't get a different ending. She just gets an older version of herself who finally stopped asking. Some things you don't heal. You just learn to fly with them. I drove out to Ohio in the fall. 2 towns over from Warren, actually. Eli Wyatt lives in a small blue house with a porch and a wife named Dana and a girl who is 9 years old and, it turns out, named Sloan. I stood on that porch for a full minute before I could knock. And when the door opened, he knew me before I said a word the way we always know each other. And this grown man with a daughter and a mortgage put his arms around a stranger and cried quietly the way he cried once, so I'd pretend not to see. Except this time, I didn't pretend. His little girl watched us from the hallway. She is my name. I have never in my life been so undone by anything. And that's the thing about family, the thing it took me 40 years and a burned arm to learn. It was never about blood. My mother shares my blood, and she put me in the garage. A 19-year-old from a town I'd never heard of, shares nothing with me but the worst afternoon of both our lives. And he named his daughter after me, and has been looking for me for 10 years to say thank you. Family is just the people who see the whole shape of you and don't ask you to cover any of it. Sometimes that's the person who raised you. And sometimes, if you're unlucky in one way and lucky in another, it's a kid you pulled out of a fire. And it takes a stranger at a dinner table to finally bring you home to each other. I still wear the watch. It still reads 4017. I've thought about getting it fixed 100 times and I never will. And I finally understand why. It was never broken. It stopped at the exact moment I became the person I actually am. And I spent 20 years hiding that moment under a sleeve because the woman who was supposed to be proud of me was ashamed of it instead. I don't hide it now. I roll the sleeve up. Roy was right about the watch. The way he was right about most things he never fully explained. You should always know what time you did it. And I do. It was 4017. I went back through the fire, and I came out the other side, and it took me most of my life to stop apologizing for the scar it left. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. Here's the whole of it, as plainly as I can put it now that the story's told. You can understand exactly why someone did the thing they did to you and still never walk back through that door. Understanding is a light, not a door. And the quietest thing in the world isn't silence. It's a person who finally stops making themselves small. My mother never learned to love me loud. It turned out I could live without the volume. What I couldn't keep living inside was the lie. So let me ask you, have you ever let the people you love believe a smaller version of you, just to keep the peace? Have you ever been needed by someone who never once truly saw you? And have you ever had to walk away from your own blood to finally stop apologizing for who you are? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are right now. If you've ever carried a family instead of being carried by one, type 4017 below. So I know you were here. Hit like if you believe respect is something you earn and not something you're owed by blood. Subscribe if you want to hear how the quiet ones win. Not with their fists, but by finally, at long last, refusing to disappear. Take care of that arm, whatever yours is. And I'll see you in the next one.